What's up, WAP? This is Mr. Linegar. Today we're going to go over Unit 6. This is over the 19th century, 20th century to present time, postmodern world. So let me introduce you to my butler, Isabella.
Hi, I am not his butler. Hi, not his butler.
All right, kiddos, let's start first about the causes of World War I, mania, or Maine, as I like to call it. Militarism, alliances. Remember, there were two alliances during this time. There was the Triple Entente, which was between Britain, France, and Russia, and the alliance, Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. When World War I started, Italy abandons Austria-Hungary and Germany and joins the alliance. They changed names. It's really weird. And Germany and Austria-Hungary gets the Ottoman Empire to help them, and they name their alliance the Central Powers. Nationalism, imperialism, a lot of these areas are fighting for the last piece of overseas empires. And the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which is the spark that causes World War I. This right here shows the alliance system, and you really see that World War I is fragmented. The Balkans is the powder keg that unites Western Europe in one of the pointless wars in the history of the world. World War I. World War I is going to promise self-determination after the war ends. It will not fulfill that. They will use colonial soldiers. You're going to see new types of machinery during this time. Trench warfare, submarines, planes, tanks, poison gas. You'll see millions of people die in this war. It's going to be the most destructive war and really the First World War, if you don't count the French and Indian War. It's going to cause financial strain on empires, and the Treaty of Versailles is going to be hugely unpopular, and the Treaty of Versailles will actually lead to World War II. The Treaty of Versailles was a treaty of revenge, but it had a couple good things. Poland will be created. It creates a League of Nations, which was not successful because it had no army, and America never joined it. And it promised no secret alliances. But it was a treaty of revenge based on based on revenge, based on guilt. Germany had to take full blame for the war. They had to pay millions of dollars, billions of dollars in reparations. They had to get rid of their army and their navy. They lost their territory of Alsace-Lorraine to France. They also lost all their overseas territories. France controls the Rhineland. They lost part of their eastern Germany to Poland, and they're forbidden to join the League of Nations. And this is going to cause a lot of Germans to be resentful, and it's going to lead to the establishment eventually in the 1930s of Adolf Hitler as dictator of Germany. And really what you see afterwards is you see really the more modern definition. Instead of these huge nation states, you see much smaller nations in Eastern Europe. All this area right here used to be the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and it's been broken apart completely. Also, this area right here used to be the Ottoman Empire, and it's also been broken up completely. Britain and France did not fulfill their obligation to give self-determination, not surprisingly. There will be acts of aggression that lead to World War II. Japan is going to attack Manchuria, China in 1931. They did it for natural resources. The League of Nations are going to condemn them but do nothing. And really during this time in the early 1930s, you're going to see appeasement where the Western European countries don't want to get involved in another war, so they don't really push the button. And they allow the Axis powers, Japan, Italy, and Germany to get away with conquering land. Italy attacks Ethiopia and later Albania. They did this to distract the Italians from the Depression, and because they had tried to fight Ethiopia in the 1800s and they lost, so this was to regain their honor. The League of Nations will do nothing again. Germany is going to start to conquer more land. They get Austria to become part of Germany in 1936. 1936. Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland become part of Germany in 1938, and Poland becomes part of Germany in 1939. The German people, the reasons the Germans conquered this is because they said there was a large German minority in these areas. The German people lived there. And really the major reason they were doing this was Lebensraum, which means more land to settle in. At first, the Western Europeans are not going to do anything, but after Germany attacks Poland, Britain and France realize that Hitler will never be happy until he conquers the world, so they declare war on Germany, which will start World War II. The Axis powers are going to be made up of Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Germany, Benito Mussolini, who was the fascist leader of Italy, who was actually the first person to become the totalitarian leader. One of the things you should remember is the Munich Conference, where Britain gave Germany all of Czechoslovakia. In return, Hitler promised to not attack anybody else, which was not successful because 6 months later, he attacks Poland. And one of the famous quotes is Chamberlain, after the Munich Conference, says there's peace for our time, which was not true. World War II is going to see increased nationalist uprisings following World War I, and as a result, the global depression. You're going to see the cost of the empires increase. U.S. is going to support anti-colonial liberation movements. In World War II, the Atlantic Charter is going to promise self-government for the people of the colonies, and actually you will see decolonization after World War II in most areas, but not every area. The Soviets, who are also going to join the World War II later on, are also going to condemn colonialism. At first, Germany is going to be very successful in World War II. Just look at this map. Bam! They have a large amount of land, and they conquer all of France, North Africa, and about half of mainland Russia. Japan will also be pretty dominant in the Pacific. They have their own little empire in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Some of the turning points in World War II, Operation Overlord in D-Day, when the Allies launched an attack through North Africa, and definitely you need to know about Stalingrad, which is not there. Eventually, Russia and America are going to conquer Germany, mostly Russia, although we give ourselves all the credit. And then America does conquer Japan almost single-handedly. We conquer it with the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and which kills between 60 to 70,000 people. And Japan will surrender. After World War II, Japan will become a democracy. They have to disband their whole armed forces. They get rid of their army. The American government tries to create a democracy in Japan in militarism and create a liberal democratic government. Japan creates a constitution that's drafted and based off the American Constitution, and they create a constitutional monarchy. They have an emperor, but he's really a figurehead. They still keep the same emperor, although a lot of Americans wanted him executed. The Japanese will accept this constitution, and they'll become industrialized, and they'll become an overseas democracy, a liberal democracy, and Japan will actually become very wealthy. In 1952, only 7 years after World War II, the Allied occupation of Japan will end, and Japan will be fully readmitted. Impact of World War II, you should remember imperialism, colonialism, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. The Great Depression, which you should definitely know about. Capitalism, the rise of totalitarian dictatorships like fascism in Italy. Communism with Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin. Industrialization in the West. I don't think I'm going to talk about a lot of the revolutions here. We need to know the Mexican Revolution of 1910, the Soviet Revolution with Vladimir Lenin, and the Chinese Revolution. World War II is going to cost millions of life. You're going to see new types of military technology be created. You'll see an end of fascism and defeat of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and militaristic Japan. You will see atrocities like the Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After World War II, you will see decolonization and creation of the Third World. You'll see independent countries like in India, China, Korea, Vietnam, Israel will be created, Middle East, and Afghanistan. And you'll see the creation of the Cold War, the U.S. versus the USSR, as superpower networks. You'll see alliance system between America and Russia with the Warsaw Pact for the Russian alliance versus NATO, the American alliance. You'll see how they both try to influence third world countries through assassinations and propping up dictatorships during the Cold War. Think Che Guevara, which you read in Miss Lamphere's class. You'll see the creation of a new United Nations, which will be dedicated to maintain peace. And you'll see peace talks to try to, and declarations of human rights and the creation of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. The formula for the 20th century revolution will be traditional rural societies will go through rapid industrialization. You'll have a corrupt and stubborn, unresponsive political system, harsh living conditions, maybe sometimes foreign intervention, and this will lead to a revolution. One of the most famous ones was the Mexican Revolution, Tierra y Libertad. That's the one with Madero, Ponce Diaz, Pancho Villa, Victoriano Huerta. Some of the results of the Mexican Revolution, they do get the Mexican Constitution of 1917, which is the real basis of Mexican law. There will be land reforms, limited foreign ownership, and less involvement in the Catholic Church and government, separation of church and state, guaranteed rights of workers, restrictions on the church, educational reforms, and workers are going to be organized and represented in the government. But the Mexican Revolution will have limited impact beyond its borders. And it's also going to lead to, eventually, the expansion of the major Mexican party, El PRI. The major slogan for the Mexican Revolution was peace, land, and bread. Originally, there was the March Revolution, the Liberal Revolution, which wanted to replace the Tsar but have a liberal democracy, but they wanted to stay in World War I. A couple months later, that's going to be overthrown by the Bolshevik or Communist Revolution, where they established a totalitarian dictatorship. Lenin will pull the Russians out of World War I in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where they give up a large parts of their land, but they get to focus on rebuilding Russia into a communist government. Russia will create a constitution in 1923 that creates a federal of socialist republics, but really it's a communist dictatorship. The USSR will become the first communist nation. The capital is moved to Moscow. It will have authoritarian dictatorship. It will create a new political and economic and cultural structure without internal challenge. And it's going to support communist revolutions throughout the world. Right here's a little chart comparing the Mexican and the Russian Revolution. I started the Mexican Revolution in 1905, which was the revolution of 1905, but the actual communist revolution doesn't start until 1917. But really, if you remember from last unit, Russia had been having internal problems like the Decembrist uprising and other radical uprisings ever since the 19th century. The Chinese Revolution is another revolution that happens. Sun Yat-sen is the father of modern China, the father of the Kuomintang Party. He helps overthrow the last empire from the Qing Dynasty in 1911. In 1949, after years of fighting between the communists and the Kuomintang, Mao Zedong makes China a communist nation after World War II. He defeats Chiang Kai-shek, also known as Zheng Ji, who flees to Taiwan. During the war, communists expand peasant base. One of the interesting things about China is they don't have a factory working class. So they rely on the peasants to be their major supporters in for communism. They also appeal to women. Remember, Chinese women have always had it really badly throughout the war. They promise them health care, divorce rights, abortion rights, access for their bodies, educational access, lower taxes, and cooperative farming. You will see growth of party during the war, in part through anti-Japanese propaganda. But after World War II ends, the Kuomintang and the communists will fight each other again. In 1949, Mao Zedong establishes the Great People's Revolution, and China becomes a communist nation. And the nationalist leaders flee to Taiwan to form their own country. You also have the Cuban Revolution, which starts in 1953 by Fidel Castro, who was upset against Fulgencio Batista, who was an American-installed puppet dictator. In 1959, he'll seize power in Cuba and make Cuba a communist nation. He'll execute opponents and create a communist state. He'll be allied very heavily with Russia and almost cause World War III a couple of times, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. We also have the Iranian Revolution, which starts in 1953. The Iranian Revolution is going to be a little bit different. This is more religious-based revolution. In 1953, Americans establish a dictatorship with Shah Reza, who comes to power with the help of the CIA. He's going to repress opposition, violate the Constitution. Also, he wasn't seen as a devout Muslim. The Ayatollah Khomeini is going to lead a revolution to create a fundamentalist Islamic state in Iran. He'll overthrow the Shah and create the first Islamic fundamentalist government. The new constitution will be based on Sharia law and extreme Islamic law. We have the Iranian hostage crisis, where they hold 55 Americans hostage for 444 days. Also, America gives guns to Iraq to go to war with Iran, Saddam Hussein, from 1980 to 1988, which causes 1 million Arab deaths. We will see the process of decolonization during this time. After World War II, you will see the process of decolonization in Africa and Asia and India. Some of it will be violent revolutions and civil war, like in China, Algeria, Vietnam, and Palestine. Some of it will be non-violent independence, like India and Ghana and Turkey. And some will be both violent and non-violent, like Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa. So decolonization in the Middle East. One of the biggest issues to affect the Middle East since World War II was the Balfour Declaration, which was after World War I, during World War I, where they promised the Jews a home state in Palestine. After World War II, they give the Jews a home state as a result of the European Holocaust. A lot of Jews are going to move to Palestine. The Arabs who had lived there for thousands of years were obviously upset about this. Britain's going to allow the Palestine to become, after the United Nations is unable to create a two-state nation, Britain's going to give Palestine all to Israel, and all the Arab nations are going to go to war against Israel in the 7 Days War, and Israel is going to actually defeat all of them when they're all by themselves, and it's going to begin the rivalry and the hatred between Israel and the Arab states. Originally, Britain proposed dividing Palestine between an Arab state and a Zionist state, but the Arabs didn't want that. They thought there should be no Israel at all. with the creation of Israel having control of Palestine, you're going to see a reaction, a rebellion against the Israelites, and you're going to see the beginning of fundamentalist terrorism. You'll see protests will take the form of civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts, also graffiti, barricades, but also stone throwing, and eventually suicide bombing and stuff like that. The Israel Defense Force is going to respond, and there are going to be heavy loss of life against Palestinian citizens. And more than 1,000 Palestinians have died in clashes, which have lasted until 1993. And a lot of this was over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Another violent movement is Algeria. From 1954 to 1962, the FLN, which is the Nationalist Party of Algeria, is going to rebel against the French and try to become independent. They appeal to Arab nationalism. The Algerians are going to use guerrilla warfare and terrorist tactics, similar to the Vietnam War. The French are going to use counterterrorism and torture. 300,000 lives will be lost. In 1962, Ahmed Ben Bella is going to become the first president of Algeria. It is a one-party state, and it's currently being challenged by Islamic fundamentalists. It's actually a more modern Islamic nation, but there is an upsurge in Islamic fundamentalism in Algeria at this moment. One of the best examples of nonviolent movements is India. The Indian National Congress was established in 1885. It was an elite group of upper middle class Indians who were educated through Western education. They have a growing idea of Indian national identity. They presented grievances against the British. They did not want to go to war. They're going to be led by Mahatma Gandhi, who's going to lead the Indian National Congress through nonviolent civil disobedience, the Salt March, not participating in World War I and World War II. And eventually, at the end of this time, they will get independence. There will be some militant leaders who are going to try to actually use violence to get India independent. The most famous example of this is B.G. Tilak, who urged terrorism and boycotts to get the British to stop. He attracted a violent conservative Hindu following, and Tilak will be exiled, and his movement will be repressed by the British government. Gandhi is going to lead a peaceful alternative. It's going to be based off of the teachings of Henry David Thoreau. MLK will later copy some of his ideas. He'll lead a nationwide protest against colonialism through boycotts and campaigns of civil resistance. The Salt March, the Homespun movement, where they make their own clothes so they don't buy from British manufacturing. His efforts are not going to be well received by Muslims, who formed a separate organization by 1906, the Muslim League by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The Muslims were afraid of India becoming one state. They wanted their own little state in northern India, which they would call Pakistan. After World War II, Pakistan and India are going to gain independence. There will be mass killings of Muslims and Hindus where they'll fight each other. 1 million people will die, and 12 million of them move to the home country. So like the Muslims in southern India will move to Pakistan and vice versa. Jawaharlal Nehru is going to become the prime minister and is going to begin modernizing India to make it a democratic nation. He's actually pretty successful. Africa is also going to go through decolonization. The Gold Coast, which is renamed Ghana, is going to become the first independent nation in Africa in 1957, led by the Western-educated Kwame Nkrumah. He will use nonviolent methods to influence. He was influenced by Gandhi. He will develop a parliamentary democracy, but he'll also, over time, become more and more of a dictator and start to use the cult of personality. By 1963, all British rule Africa, except for southern Rhodesia, was independent. Other nationalists will be, other African leaders are going to start pushing for independence. A lot of them had fought for Britain or France in World War II. You'll see the rise of Pan-Africanism. And you will see the gradual, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, independence of Africa. One of the ones that's an example of violence and nonviolence is Kenya. Kenya is going to be led by the presence of settlers in Kenya, because Kenya was a settler colony, is going to prevent a smooth transition of power. Unlike Ghana, which was just a tropical colony, which made it a little easier, Kenya had whites there and they didn't want to become independent. Jomo Kenyatta is going to use nonviolent protest, but Kenya also has 20,000 Europeans who are going to lead violent revolts against the Africans. And the Mau Mau revolt, led by Africans against the Europeans, is going to be suppressed by the British, so there will be bloodshed in Kenya. In 1963, independence will be granted to the black majority, led by Kenyatta. In 1906, Egypt was starting to get more and more independence, but in 1936, they weren't still given fully independence. In 1952, the military general Gamal Abdel Nasser is going to do a coup d'etat and take control over Egypt. He will nationalize the Suez Control. He creates Egypt into like a socialist, almost communist nation. He allies with communist Russia and tries to play the nations off each other. He does do the Suez Crisis, where he takes control over the Suez Canal. And one of his major things he tries to do is he tries to unite the Arab nations against Israel and tries to conquer Israel and destroy Israel. That was his life goal. And he tries to create pan-Arabism. South Africa also is going to go through this time. This also was a settler colony where it had 4 million white residents. The Afrikaner was the dominant white party. They won elections in 1948. They're going to practice apartheid, where they keep the races separate, like segregation. There will be no protest tolerated. So even when there was nonviolent protests, like by Nelson Mandela, they'll be massacred or they'll be locked in jail for 30, 40 years. But by the 1980s, there will start to be world boycotts against South Africa, led by Desmond Tutu. In 1990, de Klerk, who was the president of South Africa, will legalize the African National Congress, ended apartheid. He'll free Nelson Mandela from jail. 1994, apartheid will be 1994 will be the first open elections, and Nelson Mandela will be elected the first black president of South Africa. You should know these people. These are all major decolonizing leaders. Nasser in Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Nehru in India, Ataturk in Turkey, Kenyatta in Kenya, and Mao Zedong in China. And let me see. You should know this also, like the causes of the Cold War, blah, 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 leaders, all this stuff. This right here just shows the world in 1945, world today. There has been challenges of independence. There's been ethnic disputes. There have been civil wars and rivalries between different tribes. One of the best examples of this is the Rwanda genocide. A lot of these countries, even though they're independent, still have dependent economies where they produce raw resources. Some of these have grown in debt and they're reliant upon Europeans. A lot of these countries were used during the Cold War. You see the rise of religious fundamentalism in a lot of these areas as a backlash against Western European imperialism. Widespread social unrest, military dictatorships in a lot of these areas, especially Latin America. You see huge population growths, and the population growths are outpacing the economic development, so increased poverty. Resource depletion, so increase in ecological murder, environmental degradation. Lack of a middle class in a lot of these areas, except for India. Education deficit and later brain drought. A lot of the educated people in these countries are moving to like America or England. And this is neocolonialism. Decolonization was sometimes a violent process, sometimes a nonviolent process, but it started after World War II and continued to the 1970s and 80s. In many parts of the world, decolonization was not revolutionary. Power passed from one elite class to another. Little economic and social change occurred, like in Ghana. Significant challenges are still faced by independent nations, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of these nations that became independent are third world nations today. Western economic dominance of the global trade still continues today. Why? I don't know. You answer that. Cold War. After World War II, Germany is going to be divided into actually 4 pieces originally. Britain, France, and America all get apart, and then Russia gets apart. In 1949, Western Germany Britain, France, and America will all combine their area to Western Germany. They'll call themselves the Federal Republic of Germany, and they'll be allied with the non-communist nations during the Cold War. Eastern Germany will become the German Democratic Republic. It'll be a puppet state of the communist Russia, and will be allied with communist Russia and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. We do need to talk about the competing ideologies of communism versus democracy. U.S. wants to spread democracy and capitalism to Eastern Europe and they want to contain the spread of communism. Russia want to continue to occupy Eastern Europe and spread communism through their satellites in other parts of the world. The major alliance system for America was NATO. Russia was the Warsaw Pact. There's going to be a lot of different things during this time. Secret police will be used in both governments. Assassinations, they both have their own black ops groups. Stuff like that. The USS policies originally, at the start of the Cold War, would be containment. This was formed by George F. Kennan, who was one of Harry Truman's advisors, who said we need to stop the spread of communism. We can't stop it from where it's already at because it would cause World War III, but we can stop it from spreading to other areas. When it looked like Greece and Turkey were about to become communist, President Truman issued something called the Truman Doctrine, which said we would give monetary and military support to any country trying to resist a communist revolution. America is going to give billions of dollars to Western Europe to help them rebuild, to make them not want to become communist. Because usually countries are more likely to become communist when there's economic depressions. Soviets will respond in a variety of ways. They try to take control over all Berlin. Berlin was divided into two, which we talked about before. The Westerns respond by doing the Berlin airlift in 1948. A lot of people from East Berlin were trying to escape to West Berlin, and East Berlin and Russia responds by creating the Berlin Wall in 1961. The Iron Curtain is the division between the Eastern Europe and Western Europe, the communism and capitalism. The occupied countries, the Russians are going to occupy several countries on its western border to try to keep a buffer from Germany. Stalin's going to install communist governments in Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, and Yugoslavia. Stalin had originally promised free elections, but he was not going to follow through with that, which is what causes the Cold War, one of the reasons. In 1946, Stalin declares that communism and capitalism would not exist in the same world, and that war between the U.S. and the USSR was certain. Major events of the Cold War, one of them is the Korean War. After World War II, Korea was divided between North Korea communist and South Korea non-communist. China and Russia, mostly China's going to give guns to North Korea. They're going to invade South Korea. America and the United Nations will then launch an invasion to push the North Koreans back to their border. President MacArthur is going to want to nuke China and conquer China also, and Truman will fire him. An armistice will be signed after the Americans and the North Koreans are pushed, and the Americans and the South Koreans are pushed back as Chinese troops flood the border, and the border is set where it was before. And this is one of those cold proxy wars, those indirect wars in the Cold War. Cuban Revolution and the Bay of Pigs, there's another example of those indirect wars during the Cold War. The U.S. will try to the U.S. and the CIA will try to train Cuban exiles and to launch a rebellion to overthrow Castro, which will not be successful. Please remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, how we found out there was nukes in Cuba. We threatened to attack Russia and Cuba unless they got rid of the nukes. It almost led to World War III. Khrushchev is going to agree to withdraw the nukes if we agree not to invade Cuba, and in return we pull out our nuclear bombs of Turkey. One of the wars also is Vietnam. Vietnam had been ruled by the French since the late 1880s for rice, mining, and rubber exports. You're going to see a foreign educated intellectual led by Ho Chi Minh, who was actually originally very favorable towards America. He's going to create the Viet Minh Party in 1941, where he'll do guerrilla warfare against France from 1946 to 1954. In 1954, Vietnam is going to be divided between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. When the French withdrew from Vietnam, America is going to start taking their place there to help out South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh is going to form the communists in North Vietnam, while South Vietnam is going to have ties to the West. The communists, known as the Viet Cong, are beginning guerrilla warfare in South Vietnam to try to make that communist also, with North Vietnamese support. The U.S. will enter the conflict in the 1960s, 1965 specifically. They lose 50,000 people, but they face guerrilla warfare in a determined opposition. And by 1973, they pull out in the Paris Peace Accords. And in 1975, South Vietnam is going to fall to North, and all Vietnam will be a communist nation. One of the other big things is the arms race, the increased development of atomic bombs, and then the increased development of hydrogen bombs throughout World War II, throughout the Cold War, between the Soviet nations and the American nations. One of the other things is the space race. The Soviets strike first with the launch of the Sputnik, a satellite into orbit around the Earth. America was afraid they were going to lose the space race against Russia, so they established NASA, and they both tried to land a man on the moon. Russia launched the first man to the space in 1961. In 1969, America wins the space race, quote unquote, by landing a man on the moon. We will see the fall of communism during this time. During the growing sense of nationalism and desire for more political rights, and the economic inequality and the failure of communist governments, you will start to see communist governments fall in the late 1980s. Russians are going to lose grips on communism, and one of the communist leaders, Mikhail Gorbachev, who is like the chairman or president of Russia, is going to allow for openness and economic reform, which is going to make a lot of the Eastern European nations want to declare independence. Poland is going to be led by the Solidarity Movement by Wałęsa. They'll become independent in 90. Czechoslovakia will go through the Velvet Revolution, led by Václav Havel. Hungary will have a revolution in 1956, which will be unsuccessful, to be massacred by the Russians, but it will become independent in the late 1980s. East Germany will remove the Berlin Wall and will unite with West Germany in 1990. Romania is going to have one of the only violent revolutions to overthrow the communist, where they kill the communist dictator Ceausescu in 1989. Some of the reasons for the fall of communism: low worker morale, food shortages, nationalism and ethnic diversity, and the cost of having all the nuclear bombs and keeping a military presence in all parts of Eastern Europe. Glasnost was openness and allowed for freedom of speech. This allowed for people to start criticizing the government. People wanted religious freedom. Communism was very against religion. They would persecute religious people and priests. Contested elections, release of political prisoners who are then going to lead the political opposition, and books are going to be freely printed. Perestroika, which was what Mikhail Gorbachev did, where he tried to create a somewhat industrialized and somewhat capitalist economy that showed communism, some private property, some small businesses, some free trade. He tried to decentralize economic control, and these things, even though they were meant to keep the Russian government going, actually led faster to the decline of communism in Russia. There's going to be an attempted coup where they try to get rid of Gorbachev. It will not be successful, and after they try to get rid of him, Boris Yeltsin will take control over Russia. He'll declare an end of the USSR. He'll declare the beginning of the Russian Federation. The USSR will soon split into 15 republics, and Russia will become a democracy, quote unquote. During this time, we're going to see the growth of global economies. The global Great Depression did hurt this. You will see interdependence along the world, the emergence of the Pacific Rim, the Little Tigers, as one of the major industrialized areas. You will see the increase of globalization also. NAFTA, the WTO, consumerism, and obviously religious responses to globalization and how they think that Western values are being forced on them. International terrorism is also one of the results of Western European imperialism and westernization and globalism. Al-Qaeda, 9/11, Osama bin Laden's 9/11 attack. Other examples are Hamas in Israel, Hezbollah in Lebanon, suicide bombers in Israel and Iraq, Tamil Tigers in India, and the IRA in Northern Ireland, who are trying to get all of Ireland to be an independent nation. We had the rise of NGOs, international organizations during this time: League of Nations, United Nations, Organization of African Unity. Also, we see the rise of human rights, especially after World War II. We see the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, the genocide conventions, where they actually start trying people who commit war crimes. They make laws against child labor, soldiers, and slavery. But even though there are laws against genocides, this decade, the 20th century, was the decade of genocides. And if you look right here, a lot of genocides, buddy. Yeah, not good. There will be social reforms during this time. You'll see the rise of feminine. Women will get the right to vote in Britain, Germany, and America after World War I. And they'll be given the right to vote after World War II in a lot of other areas. You'll see the rise of the civil rights movement globally, especially in the 1950s in America. Anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. You'll see secularization of society in Western Europe, more gender equality, sexual revolution, gay rights in 1970s, 1960s. During this time, you'll see continued urbanization, destruction of the environment. This will lead to the Green Revolution and the Green Movement, the Green Peace Movement. Ozone depletion, what is that called? Where the ozone's being depleted. Oh my God. Inconvenient truth, Al Gore. Oh my God, Mr. Pope's going to kill me. Global warming. Okay, oh my God. And one of the biggest things that happened during this time is the population boom, where there's a huge increase in population in parts of Africa, Latin America, India, and Asia, which is really not keeping up with their economy, which is causing them to go more into poverty. And it's actually causing the population to reach a point where it probably can't support itself. And the population boom is an important term you should definitely know and understand what it is, and why it is that those areas specifically has gone through huge population increases. All right, kids, that's all I have for today, and that's the very last video for this very last year. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment or anything. Comment on YouTube, email me, text me, whatever. And hope you enjoyed these videos all year long, and I will see you next year. Deuces.